The morning light spilled through the glass walls of Westfield Enterprises, slicing across the lobby in golden streaks that shimmered on marble floors. The building itself stood like a monument to ambition, 50 stories of steel and mirrored glass that caught the sun as if it belonged to it. Inside, men and women moved with purpose, shoes clicking sharply against the tile, phones pressed to ears, voices low but urgent. Everything about the place whispered wealth, control, and the unrelenting rhythm of success. And then there was Lily Morgan, a small figure standing at the threshold, clutching a faded pink backpack against her chest as though it were armor. Her sneakers were clean but frayed at the edges, the laces tied in uneven bows. She tilted her head back to look at the towering atrium, her breath catching at the dizzying height of it all. To her, the building looked alive, a giant made of glass and silver, breathing with the heartbeat of hundreds of strangers. Lily's fingers tightened around a crumpled newspaper clipping, the ink slightly smudged from her grip. She'd folded and unfolded it so many times that the creases had started to tear. The words administrative assistant, Westfield Enterprises were still visible, underlined in shaky pencil. Beneath it, a note written in neat looping handwriting. Interview, 9 a.m. Be brave, my Lily. Her mother's words. The security guard at the front desk spotted her immediately. He was a tall man with kind eyes, but confusion clouded his face as he leaned forward. Hey there, sweetheart, he said, lowering his voice so as not to alarm her. Are you lost? Where are your parents? Lily straightened her shoulders. She'd practiced this part and in front of the mirror over and over. I'm not lost, sir, she said, her voice higher than she'd meant it to be. I'm here for my interview. With Mr. Westfield. The guard blinked. For a moment he wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Your interview? He repeated, glancing toward the security console, then back at her. You mean, the CEO? Yes, sir. She lifted the newspaper clipping for him to see, pressing it flat on the desk with her small hands. It says right here, 9 o'clock. I'm not late, am I? The man's mouth opened and closed again, lost somewhere between amusement and concern. Around them, the rhythm of the lobby continued. People swiping badges, the ding of elevators, the faint hum of conversation. But for a heartbeat, time seemed to pause. The guard leaned closer, voice gentle now. Little miss, this is a very busy place. Maybe we should call your mom or dad, huh? That word, mom, flickered something behind Lily's bright green eyes. She can't come, she said quickly, her chin lifting in defiance. But I can. I'm here to help her. Before he could reply, a flood of employees swept through the revolving doors and were a blur of suits, coffee cups, and chatter. Lily used the distraction like she'd planned it. In one swift motion, she slipped past the desk, her sneakers padding silently across the polished floor. Hey, wait, the guard called. But she was already pressing the elevator button with both hands, heart pounding like a drum. The mirrored doors opened with a soft chime and she darted inside. Her reflection stared back at her. Small, determined, and a little scared. She scanned the row of glowing buttons, found the one marked 48, and pressed it with trembling fingers. The elevator began to rise, smooth and silent, lifting her toward the unknown. Lily clutched her backpack tighter, feeling the flutter of nerves deep in her stomach. She thought of her mother's pale smile that morning, the way she'd whispered, "You're my brave girl." Outside, the city fell away as the elevator climbed higher and higher. Lily could see her reflection against the window now, a tiny figure in a sea of glass and sky. She squared her shoulders, whispering to herself, "You can do this. Be brave, it's very important." Down below, the guard picked up the phone to call for assistance, but by the time anyone looked, the elevator numbers were already climbing past 30. By the time the door slid open again, Lily Morgan had entered a different world, one of power, precision, and impossible stakes. And though no one knew it yet, this small, determined girl was about to change everything. The elevator chimed softly as the doors parted, revealing a corridor that felt more like a museum than an office hallway. The walls were lined with dark walnut panels, each polished to a mirror sheen, broken only by framed awards and gleaming brass plaques bearing words Lily couldn't quite pronounce. The carpet beneath her shoes was thick and silent, the kind that swallowed sound. Every detail whispered of money, of perfection, of a world built to keep small, imperfect things out. Lily stepped forward, her sneakers sinking slightly into the carpet. The door behind her closed with a muted hiss. She was alone. Her heart thudded in her chest, loud in the silence. The numbers 48 still glowed faintly on the elevator display, proof that she'd made it. But now, standing here among polished glass and quiet authority, doubt crept in like a chill. What if this was a mistake? What if Mr. Westfield didn't want to see her at all? No. She shook her head hard, just like her mom would when trying to chase away bad thoughts. "You're brave, Lily," she whispered under her breath. "Mom said you could do this." At the end of the hallway, a glass door bore a name etched in silver: Alexander Westfield, Chief Executive Officer. The letters looked sharp enough to cut. Through the frosted paneling, she saw the vague outline of someone moving, tall, controlled all sharp angles. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and marched toward the door. Inside, Alexander Westfield sat behind a desk large enough to host a small dinner party. He was reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet, one hand tapping against the glass in a rhythm only he understood. Every movement was precise, efficient, almost surgical. His office was everything his reputation promised: minimalist, cold, commanding. The Boston skyline stretched endlessly behind him through a floor-to-ceiling window, sunlight gleaming off skyscrapers that stood like chess pieces he'd already conquered. He didn't believe in wasting time. Time, to Alexander, was a currency more valuable than gold, and anyone who cost him even seconds was already in debt. "Send in the first candidate," he said into the intercom. Voice clipped, eyes never leaving his tablet. "Yes, Mr. Westfield," came the crisp reply from his temporary assistant. "Ms. Winters." He heard the soft click of the door opening, then silence. He waited a moment, expecting footsteps, the polite cough of a nervous applicant, but nothing came. Annoyed, he looked up and froze. A small figure stood in the doorway, a little girl no taller than his desk, clutching a faded pink backpack. Her blonde hair was divided into slightly uneven pigtails, and her bright green eyes darted around the room with a mix of awe and fear. Alexander blinked, convinced this was some sort of mistake. "Excuse me?" he said sharply.
"How did you get in here?"
"This is a restricted floor." Lily swallowed hard, then stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here for the interview, sir." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "The interview?" His tone carried a hint of disbelief and something else. "For which position exactly?" "The administrative assistant one." She pulled a crumpled newspaper clipping from her backpack and placed it carefully on his desk, smoothing out the wrinkles with trembling fingers. "It says 9 o'clock. I'm not late." Alexander leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. Somewhere, Ms. Winters was probably realizing her mistake and panicking. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," he began, his voice firm but measured. "This position requires—" "It's for my mom," Lily blurted out, cutting him off. "She couldn't come. She's sick again today. But I can help. I know my times tables and I'm very organized." The words tumbled out so quickly she nearly tripped over them, her face flushed with determination and in fear. Alexander blinked again. He was rarely caught off guard, but this was something entirely different. "Your mother sent you here?" he asked, incredulous. Lily hesitated. "No, sir," she said softly. "She doesn't know. She was too tired. But she said this interview was important." "Really important?" Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't just childish defiance, and it was desperation wrapped in bravery. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said quietly. She climbed up onto the oversized leather chair, her feet dangling well above the floor. Her backpack sat beside her like a loyal companion. Alexander leaned forward, studying her. "What's your name?" "Lily Morgan." "I'm 7. I'll be 8 in November. And your mother's name?" "Sarah Morgan." The name stirred something faint, a flicker in the back of his mind, but he pushed it away. "And why," he asked slowly, "did you think you could take her place?" Lily's gaze dropped to her lap. Her small fingers twisted together as she whispered, "Because she needs this job, sir. She cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep. I thought if I could help, maybe she wouldn't be sad anymore." The room fell utterly still. Alexander, who had built empires on logic, numbers, and strategy, found himself suddenly without words. He looked down at the resume she'd handed him, neatly typed, professional attached to the clipping. The name again, Sarah Morgan. and their underemployment history, Hartwick Financial. Something in his chest tightened. He had heard that name before. In fact, he'd bought that name, bought it, gutted it, and folded it into Westfield Enterprises 18 months ago. Hundreds of employees had lost their jobs. He remembered the outrage, the protests. He remembered a man named Hartwick standing on the courthouse steps, calling him a soulless opportunist who destroys lives to feed his ego. And now, here was one of those lives, sitting across from him, feet barely touching the edge of the seat. A small girl who had come to reclaim something her mother lost. Alexander exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, watching her with a strange mix of curiosity and unease. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say, and for the first time in his life, the silence between words felt heavier than any deal he'd ever signed. Outside, the city continued to pulse and move, unaware that on the 48th floor, a man known as the Shark had just met the one person capable of breaking through his armor, and she was only 7 years old. The clock on Alexander Westfield's desk ticked louder than it ever had before. A sound he had never noticed until that moment seemed to echo through the office like a reminder that something extraordinary had just stepped into his world, something he couldn't calculate or control. Lily Morgan sat perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide as she took in the walls of glass and steel surrounding her. Behind her, the skyline of Boston glittered in the morning sun. But Alexander's gaze never left the little girl. He had met politicians, billionaires, and board members who could talk him into million-dollar deals without flinching. None of them had ever unsettled him like this child. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert the tone of authority that came as naturally as breathing. "So, Lily," he began, voice even, "tell me, why do you think your mother should work here?" The question was meant to be polite, a formality, a way to guide the conversation back into something he could handle. But Lily's answer wasn't what he expected. "Because she never gives up," she said quietly. "Even when she's tired. Even when she gets sick. She keeps smiling for me." Alexander blinked. The words pierced through the practiced indifference he'd worn for years. "She says that if we keep trying, things will get better. She says, people always need help and good jobs help people." Her small voice trembled, but she pushed on. "And I thought if I come here and ask nice, maybe you'd see that she's the best person for your job." She slid a folder across the desk, the same one she'd pulled from her backpack earlier. It was decorated with stickers on the corner, faded rainbows and stars trying to make a grown-up document look a little less scary. Alexander hesitated, then opened it. Inside were carefully printed pages, a resume, a recommendation letter, and at the very back a drawing. It wasn't meant for him. It was a child's drawing sketched in bright crayon colors. A small woman with curly hair and a little girl stood hand in hand beside a big glass building labeled Westfield. Above them in shaky block letters were the words, "Mommy's new job." Alexander's throat tightened before he could stop it. He closed the folder and leaned back, trying to steady himself. "Lily," he said, keeping his voice calm, "your mother used to work for a company called Hartwick Financial, didn't she?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. She said it was the best place ever. Her boss was nice. Everyone was nice until—" She stopped. "Until what?" he asked gently. "Until your company bought it." The words hit him like a physical blow. She said everything changed. One day they told her not to come back, that her job didn't exist anymore. She cried a lot that night, but she said it wasn't your fault. She said it was just business. Lily looked down, twisting her fingers. But after that, she got sick a lot. She works all the time now. Sometimes I have to make dinner. I'm not very good at it, but I try. Her voice was soft, matter-of-fact, and for some reason that made it worse. Alexander looked away toward the window. The reflection staring back at him was that of a man used to being feared, not questioned. But now, sitting in front of him, a 7-year-old girl had done both without meaning to. He suddenly remembered the day of the acquisition, how his team had celebrated, how he'd justified the layoffs in interviews by saying, efficiency requires sacrifice, how proud he'd been when the stock price climbed. The memory tasted like ash. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Westfield," said Ms. Winter's voice, crisp and professional. "The other candidates are waiting. You also have the board meeting at 10. Alexander's eyes stayed locked on Lily. Tell them there'll be a delay, he said quietly. There was a pause on the other end. Delay, sir? Yes. He disconnected the call before she could ask more. The little girl blinked at him, surprised. You're not mad? He almost smiled and almost. Not yet, he said. But I'd like to know more. Where's your mother now, Lily? The question hung heavy in the air. Lily bit her lip, then said in a small voice, She's at Boston Memorial Hospital. She told me not to tell anyone because she didn't want to lose the interview. She said she'd be home soon, but... She trailed off. Alexander leaned forward. But what? Sometimes she doesn't come home when she says she will. Her words were simple, but the fear behind them was raw. He pressed his fingertips together, trying to think, to reason. You came here by yourself? Yes, sir. I took the bus. Mommy showed me how. I had birthday money left. It was for the fare, but this was more important. For the first time in years, Alexander Westfield didn't know how to respond. He had made entire companies bend to his will, but he couldn't command this moment. He could only feel it, and sharp, deep, unavoidable. He studied her again, the way she sat up straight, trying to be brave even as her legs dangled far above the floor. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face, the shape of her eyes, the way she furrowed her brow when she was nervous. A ghost of recognition flickered across his mind. Fleeting. Impossible. Lily, he said after a long silence, his voice quieter now. I think your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. Lily brightened just a little. She is. She says people can always start again even if everything falls apart. She says that's what brave people do. Alexander nodded slowly, the weight of those words pressing against him like a confession he hadn't made yet. He reached for the phone again, his decision already forming in the quiet of his heart. Ms. Winters, he said when the line opened, cancel the rest of my morning. And find out which room Sarah Morgan is in at Boston Memorial Hospital. The assistant hesitated. Sir? You heard me, he said, his tone final. When he hung up, Lily was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. Are you going to help my mom? She asked softly. Alexander looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the ruthless businessman vanished. What remained was a man staring at a choice, one that might change his life forever. Yes, Lily, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. I'm going to see your mother. She smiled, a small, fragile thing. Can I come too? She gets scared when she's alone. He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I think you should. As she slid off the chair and slipped her hand into his, he felt the tiniest shock, the warmth of a hand that didn't belong in his cold, controlled world. And though he didn't yet understand why, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had touched something long lost, something that felt a lot like home. The sleek black sedan glided through Boston's late morning traffic like a silent shadow, the kind that didn't stop for lights or obstacles. Inside, the air was thick with tension, not the kind born from fear, but from silence that meant too much. Lily sat in the back seat beside Alexander Westfield, her legs swinging above the floor mats, her backpack resting on her lap like a shield. She stared out the window, watching the city blur past, a patchwork of sunlight and glass. Alexander hadn't spoken since they'd left the tower. The engine hummed softly, the faint scent of leather and cologne filling the car. His reflection in the tinted glass looked unfamiliar even to him, his usual composure replaced by something he couldn't quite name. He'd made impulsive choices before, but none like this. Canceling his board meeting to accompany a child to a hospital? It was unthinkable. And yet, the farther they drove, the more certain he felt that he needed to see where this road ended. Lily broke the silence first. Mr. Westfield, she said quietly, eyes still fixed on the window. Do you have kids? The question hit harder than he expected. No, he replied after a pause. I don't. She nodded as if she'd already known. Mom says people who don't have kids sometimes forget how to smile when things are small. Like cookies or snow. She turned to him, her green eyes studying his face. But you don't look like you forgot. You just look like you put it somewhere safe and can't find it right now. Alexander blinked, stunned by the clarity of her words. No board member, no psychologist, no rival had ever made him feel so transparent. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. When they reached Boston Memorial, the air outside hit them cold and sharp. The hospital loomed against the gray sky, all glass and pale stone, but instead of power and ambition, it reeked of fatigue and waiting. A place where hope was rationed out by the hour. Lily led the way inside. Her small hand gripped the strap of her backpack tightly. Her chin lifted with the kind of courage that only children desperate to appear grown possess. Alexander followed, earning double takes from nurses and patients alike. The CEO of one of the city's most powerful corporations didn't usually walk through those doors without cameras flashing, and certainly not with a little girl at his side. At the front desk, Lily spoke before he could. "Sarah Morgan, please. She's my mom," the nurse typed quickly, glanced up. "Room 317, she's stable today, sweetheart, stable." The word should have been reassuring, but something in the nurse's careful tone made Alexander uneasy. They rode the elevator up in silence. The same soft chime that had announced Lily's arrival at his office now echoed in this sterile place, carrying an eerie sense of symmetry. When the doors opened, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Machines beeped rhythmically behind closed doors. Lily's steps slowed. "Sometimes she's sleeping," she whispered. "Sometimes she forgets things for a little while." They reached room 317. The door was ajar and the sound of a slow, steady monitor filled the air. Lily hesitated only a second before pushing it open. Sarah Morgan lay against white sheets, her skin pale beneath the fluorescent lights. An IV line trailed from her arm, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Even in weakness, there was something graceful about her, the quiet dignity of someone who had fought far too long with too little. Lily ran to her side, clutching her mother's hand. "Mom, look who came." Sarah stirred, eyelids fluttering open. Her voice was a whisper of its former strength. "Lily, sweetheart, you shouldn't have come alone." Then her gaze drifted past her daughter and froze. Alexander. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Recognition flashed in her eyes, shock, disbelief, and something deeper. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. "You," she breathed. "Alexander Westfield." He stepped closer, the sound of his polished shoes soft on the tile. "Hello, Sarah." His voice was lower than before, stripped of authority. "It's been a long time." Lily looked between them, confused. "You know my mom?" Neither answered. The silence between Sarah and Alexander spoke more than words could. He could see the memories flicker in her expression, the laughter they'd shared years ago in crowded boardrooms, the late nights spent drafting business plans and whispering about dreams they were too young to name. The warmth that had once existed between them cut short without closure. Sarah's voice trembled. "Why are you here, Alexander?" He swallowed, his throat dry. "Because your daughter came to my office. She wanted to get you a job. She thought I could help." Sarah turned her gaze to Lily, eyes filling with tears. "Oh, sweetheart. You shouldn't have done that. But you said you needed the job," Lily said softly. "I thought I could help." The tenderness in that moment made Alexander's chest ache. He could feel the walls he'd built his entire career beginning to fracture. For years, he had buried regret under success, mergers, profits, accolades. But now it was all peeling away under the weight of a little girl's love. Sarah's breathing grew shallow again. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. This isn't your problem." Alexander stepped closer to the bed. "Maybe it is," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. She looked at him sharply, searching his face. And then something flickered there, realization. She'd always known him as composed, relentless, untouchable, but in this moment he looked almost human. The monitor beeped softly as she whispered, "You didn't know, did you?" His brow furrowed. "Know what?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time fear crept into her expression. "About Lily." Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sudden, irreversible, electric. Lily, still holding her mother's hand, looked up at the two adults, sensing the shift but not understanding. "Mom?" she asked softly. "What do you mean?" Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. He should have known," she whispered. He had a right to know. Alexander took a half step back, the world tilting beneath him. Every muscle in his body went rigid as the truth began to crystallize, impossible and yet undeniable. The reflection he'd seen in Lily's eyes. The shape of her smile. The way she'd said, "You look like you forgot how to smile, but you didn't lose it." He understood now, And as the heart monitor hummed between them, Alexander Westfield, the man who built an empire on control, realized that the one thing he'd never accounted for was the cost of what he'd left behind. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the steady hum of the heart monitor and the low, rhythmic hiss of oxygen flowing through the narrow plastic tubing beside the hospital bed. The world outside might have still been spinning, cars honking, phones ringing, meetings happening. But inside room 317, time had folded into something fragile, suspended on the edge of truth. Alexander Westfield stood frozen near the foot of the bed. The words he should have known kept echoing through him like a bell struck deep underwater, distant yet deafening. He looked from Sarah to Lily and back again, trying to make sense of what he already feared was true. "Sarah," he said, voice tight. "What do you mean, I should have known?" She turned her face toward the window, as if the sunlight spilling across the floor might give her courage. Her voice when it came was quiet, not weak but worn. "Because you were there," she whispered, "before everything went wrong. Before you became him, the man they call the shark." Lily looked between them, her little brow furrowing. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Sarah reached out and brushed a trembling hand over her daughter's hair. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, life forgets to tell people the truth. And by the time it remembers, it's almost too late." Alexander's pulse hammered in his ears. "Sarah," he said again, stepping closer, "you can't just say that and stop. What truth? What are you trying to tell me?" Her eyes met his then, weary, resigned, but still sharp enough to pierce through the armor he'd spent a decade forging. "I tried to tell you once," she said. "You'd already left Hartwick by then. You had bigger plans, mergers, headlines, your name on every magazine cover." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "I was just another line item on a payroll you were too busy to read." He felt the words like stones sinking through him. "You could have called." "You could have." "I did," she interrupted softly. "Once, but your assistant said you were unavailable. So I stopped trying. And when I found out I was pregnant, the world seemed to tilt." The monitor's rhythmic beeping suddenly sounded too loud, too slow, like the ticking of some merciless clock. Alexander gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "You're saying, yes." Her voice broke slightly. "Lily is your daughter." Lily froze, her small hand still resting on her mother's. "Mom?" Sarah turned to her gently. "Sweetheart, I didn't want you to find out like this." Alexander stared at the child, at his child, as if seeing her for the first time. The green eyes that had haunted him all morning were his mother's shade. The faint dimple in her left cheek, his. Every piece fit together now, cruel in its clarity. Lily tilted her head, confusion shadowing her face. "You mean, Mr. Westfield is my dad?" Her voice was so innocent, so fragile that Alexander's chest constricted painfully. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. For years he had built his life on control, strategy, composure. And now, words had abandoned him entirely. Sarah's breathing had grown shallow again. "I didn't want him to know like this," she murmured half to herself. Not when it was already too late to fix anything. Alexander stepped closer, shaking his head. "It's not too late. Sarah, listen to me. Whatever happened before, whatever I didn't know, I can make this right. I will." She gave a faint, sad smile. "You can't buy time, Alexander. You can't merge your way out of regret." "Don't do this," he said hoarsely. "Not now. Don't talk like—" But the monitor's rhythm had quickened, an erratic tremor of warning. Nurses passing the open doorway glanced in, alerted by instinct. Lily clutched her mother's hand tighter. "Mommy?" Sarah turned her head weakly toward her daughter. "It's okay, baby. I'm just tired. You were so brave today. I'm so proud of you." Her words faltered, breath coming thinner now. Alexander pressed the call button on the wall, shouting for help as panic clawed its way through his chest. A flood of nurses rushed in, machines beeping, commands being exchanged in calm, clinical voices that didn't match the chaos in his heart. He was pulled back toward the wall, watching helplessly as they worked. Oxygen, vitals, compressions. Lily cried into his sleeve, trembling, her small fists gripping his coat. He'd never felt so useless in his life. Minutes stretched into eternity before the monitor steadied again. Weak but constant. One of the nurses glanced over her shoulder. "She's stable, but she needs rest." No stress, no excitement. When the staff cleared out, Alexander remained standing at the foot of the bed, chest heaving, staring at the woman he'd once loved, the woman he'd unknowingly abandoned. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, faintly aware of him still there. "You were always good at saving companies," she whispered. "Now maybe you can save something smaller, something that actually matters." Her gaze drifted toward Lily, who had fallen asleep against Alexander's side. Exhaustion overtaking fear. "Don't let her grow up without knowing who you really are," she said softly. "Not the man in the magazines, the man who once dreamed of doing good." He knelt beside the bed, voice breaking. "I'll make it right. I swear I will." Sarah gave him a faint nod, eyes closing once more. "Then start with her," she murmured. "She already believes in you." The room fell silent again except for the faint hum of machines. Alexander looked down at Lily, this tiny miracle of second chances, sleeping against him, her hand still clutching the edge of his jacket. He had spent years conquering everything the world said mattered, and yet, in this quiet hospital room, surrounded by antiseptic and sorrow, he realized he'd lost the only thing that truly did. For the first time in his life, Alexander Westfield wept. Not out of failure, not out of loss, but because, after all his years of running from the human cost of success, he had finally been caught. The sky over Boston had changed by the time Alexander stepped out of the hospital that night. The sharp blue of morning had faded into a bruised violet twilight, and the glass towers that once gleamed with pride now glared back at him, accusing. Rain threatened the horizon, low clouds swollen and heavy, and the wind off the Charles carried that strange electric stillness that comes just before a storm. He didn't go back to his penthouse. He couldn't. Instead, he walked. Down, past the taxis crowding the curb, past the newsstand with his own photograph still staring out from a glossy magazine cover. Alexander Westfield, the man who never loses. The headline made him sick. Inside the hospital, Sarah slept, her body too fragile to argue with the medicine dripping steadily through her veins, and in the chair beside her, little Lily had finally drifted into exhausted dreams, clutching her mother's sweater like a promise that things would get better. He had stayed until both were asleep, sitting in the dark and listening to the machines breathe for the woman who'd once taught him what kindness sounded like. Now he walked through the city alone, the rain finally breaking and falling in thin silver needles that soaked through his coat. By the time he reached the Westfield Tower, it was nearly midnight. The lobby lights burned all night, sterile, constant, as if even darkness needed permission to enter. He stood before the glass doors for a long time, staring at the reflection that looked back. The reflection of a man who had traded people for profit, compassion for control. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Success had not made him powerful, it had made him hollow. He rode the elevator, up alone. No assistant, no security, no entourage. Only the soft whine of cables and the echo of his own thoughts. When the doors opened onto the 48th floor, the office was silent except for the distant hum of the city below. He moved through the darkness, flicking on one small desk lamp. The golden circle of light fell across papers, contracts, acquisition lists, monuments to every empire he had built and broken. On the very top of the pile was a letter from the board, a reminder of his morning meeting, postponed. He read the first line and almost laughed. The shareholders are concerned about public image following the Hartwick acquisition fallout. He dropped the paper into the trash. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. He almost ignored it, until instinct, or guilt, made him answer. "Mr. Westfield?" a man's voice said. "This is Dr. Hayes from Boston Memorial. Your contact information was left by Miss Morgan's chart." His stomach tightened. "Is she all right?" "She's stable, but the prognosis isn't simple. Chronic fatigue, organ strain. We'll know more in the morning. The little girl's been asking for you, though." That stopped him cold. "She's awake?" "Barely, but yes. She wouldn't go to sleep until we promised to tell you." The line went dead before he could respond. He stood there, drenched in the glow of the single lamp, the city's heartbeat pulsing beyond the window, and realized that for the first time in his life, someone needed him. Not his signature, not his influence, Not his money. Just him. At dawn, he was back at the hospital. Lily was awake, sitting cross-legged on the chair beside her mother's bed, coloring quietly on the back of a prescription form. When she saw him, her whole face brightened. "You came back," she said, as if she had never doubted it, but wanted to be sure anyway. "I told you I would." She held up her drawing, a big building, 2 stick figures holding hands in front of it. "You and me," she said proudly, "and Mommy when she gets better." The simplicity of it undid him. He crouched beside her. "That's perfect." He meant it. Sarah stirred at the sound of their voices. Her eyes opened, weak but clear. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, but the protest had no force behind it. He took her hand gently. "Then where else should I be?" For a long time, neither spoke. The machines filled the silence with their steady pulse, the fragile music of survival. Finally, she said, "You don't owe us anything, Alexander. What's done is done." He shook his head slowly. "No. What's done is what I ignored. What's not done is what I need to fix." She gave a faint, tired laugh. "You always did like impossible deadlines." Later that morning, Alexander stood at the window of the hospital cafeteria, coffee cooling untouched in his hands. Through the glass he could see the parking lot, the skyline, and beyond that, the silver needle of Westfield Enterprises stabbing upward into the clouds. It looked smaller from here, insignificant. He took out his phone and opened the company chat thread. His fingers hovered over the screen for a long time before typing a message that would ripple through every floor by noon. Effective immediately, all Hartwick Financial employees terminated during the 2023 acquisition will receive full reinstatement offers or severance restoration. New initiative, the Morgan Fund, focused on healthcare assistance for displaced workers. Details to follow. He hit send, and then he exhaled, a sound that felt like the first real breath in years. Back upstairs, Lily was sitting by her mother, again, humming softly, her hand tracing patterns on the blanket. Sarah looked up when he entered. "You did something," she said, reading it in his eyes. "Maybe the first thing that ever mattered," he answered. She smiled faintly. "You can't undo everything, Alexander." "No," he said, glancing at Lily. "But maybe I can build something better with what's left." Lily looked between them, eyes bright. "Does that mean you're staying?" He hesitated, then nodded. "It means I'm not going anywhere." The little girl grinned and leaned against him, small and warm and fearless. Outside, the storm that had hung over the city finally broke, rain streaking down the hospital windows like silver threads. And as the thunder rolled over Boston, Alexander Westfield realized that for once he didn't feel trapped by the sky above him. He felt washed clean by it. He looked down at Sarah, pale but alive, and then at the tiny hand curled trustingly around his own. For the first time in his life, he wasn't building an empire. He was building a life. Morning sunlight spilled through the hospital blinds, soft and golden, painting everything it touched with fragile hope. The storm that had rolled over Boston during the night had passed, leaving the air washed clean, the city gleaming as if it too had been forgiven. In room 317, Alexander sat in the chair beside Sarah's bed. Lily was asleep, her head resting in his lap, a faint smile curving her lips. Every now and then, she murmured something in her dreams, fragments of words that sounded like home, mom, job. Simple things, important things. Sarah stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled faintly when she saw them together. "You stayed," she whispered. He nodded, his voice low. "I told you I would." She studied him quietly for a long moment, as though seeing him clearly for the first time. "You look different," she said. "Softer, that's good on you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I did what I could. I started a fund in your name, rehiring the people from Hartwick. The company's already calling me sentimental." Sarah's lips curved faintly. "You always cared what they called you. Until now." He leaned closer. "I don't anymore." For a moment, they simply watched each other, Two people bound by everything that had been lost and the small, stubborn chance that something could still be saved. That afternoon, the doctor came with news that should have been comforting but wasn't. Sarah's condition had stabilized, but her recovery would take time. She needed treatment, extensive, expensive, and urgent. Alexander didn't hesitate. "Do whatever it takes," he said. "Cost isn't a factor." The doctor nodded politely, but when he left, Sarah shook her head. "You can't just throw money at this, Alexander. You can't fix everything that way." He took her hand gently. "Maybe not. But I can try." Her fingers tightened around his. "I'm not afraid of what happens to me," she said softly. "I'm afraid of what happens to her if I don't get better." Lily had woken by then, her eyes wide and quiet, listening. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just reached over and took both their hands in hers, a bridge between two broken pieces of the same story. Days passed. Sarah's condition improved slowly, and for the first time in years, Alexander wasn't in his office at dawn. He split his time between the hospital and the company, but when he was in that silver tower, something had changed. People whispered in the elevators. "He's different now." They noticed the way he listened longer in meetings, the way he stopped firing people for small mistakes, the way he walked through the building like a man who had remembered something vital, yet not everyone approved. At a late-night board meeting, his chief financial officer, a cold man named Grayson Pierce, threw down a stack of reports. "This Morgan fund is draining company reserves. You're turning a Fortune 500 into a charity, Alexander." Alexander's gaze was steady. "Maybe it's time this company gave back what it took." "You're risking everything," Pierce snapped. "Investors are already uneasy." He stood. "Then let them be uneasy. They can rebuild what matters." I did. Back at the hospital, Sarah watched the news one evening from her bed. The headline read, "Westfield Enterprises shifts corporate direction. CEO promises people first." She smiled, her fingers brushing the TV remote as if she could reach through the screen and touch him. Lily sat on the windowsill coloring another picture, this time of three, stick figures holding hands under a shining sun. Across the page in large letters she'd written, "The Westfield family." "Mommy," she said, looking up. "When you get better, can we all live together?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see." But fate wasn't done testing them yet. That night, as the city slept under a veil of calm, Sarah's heart faltered again. The monitor screamed to life, alarms echoing down the sterile hallway. Nurses rushed in, voices clipped and urgent. Alexander arrived 10 minutes later, still in his suit from a charity dinner. He froze in the doorway. The chaos, the flashing lights, the sound of Lily crying. It was everything he'd feared since the day he walked back into that hospital. They worked for 20 endless minutes. And then the room fell quiet. Lily's small voice broke the silence. "Mommy?" A nurse bent down and whispered softly, tears in her eyes. Alexander didn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He knew. The world that had once belonged entirely to him, the towers, the wealth, the power, now felt unbearably small. He crossed the room, knelt beside Lily, and pulled her close. Her sobs muffled against his chest. Sarah's face was peaceful, her hand still resting near the drawing Lily had made, the one with 3 figures and the bright sun. In the days that followed, the city moved on. But something in Alexander did not. He buried Sarah quietly, no cameras, no headlines, just him, Lily, and a handful of flowers that smelled faintly of the life they should have had together. The tombstone read simply, "Sarah Morgan, beloved mother, fierce heart." She made the world gentler for those who forgot how. After the service, Lily stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. "Where will we go now?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. He looked down at her, his chest aching with equal parts sorrow and resolve. "Home," he said, "but where's that?" He looked toward the horizon, the skyline glinting under the sun. "Wherever you are," he said quietly. "That's home." Months passed, a new sign went up at Westfield Enterprises. The Morgan Initiative, building futures, not fortunes. It wasn't a slogan. It was a vow. Lily visited often, her backpack replaced by a school bag now. She had a desk of her own in his office, a corner with crayons and a small plant she'd insisted was company property. Sometimes, She'd look up from her drawings and ask, "Do you think Mommy can see us?" Alexander always smiled softly. Every day. He meant it. On a quiet Friday evening, long after the office had emptied, Alexander stood by the window again, watching the city glow beneath him. This time he didn't see towers or profit margins. He saw people, thousands of tiny lives moving, struggling, loving, surviving. He thought of Sarah, of Lily, of the strange, miraculous way the world had spun them back into his orbit. A voice broke the silence behind him. "Dad?" He turned. Lily stood in the doorway, her hair a little longer now, her smile shy but steady. "Can we go home?" she asked. He crossed the room, lifted her into his arms, and kissed the top of her head. "Yeah," he said softly. "Let's go home." As they left, the elevator doors slid shut behind them, sealing the empty office in golden twilight. On the desk, a single drawing remained. 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright sun, the words written in bold crayon letters. "We're together now."